Hello, my name's Cynthia Katsarelis. I'm the music director and conductor of Musica Colorado Chamber Orchestra, and welcome to our pre-concert talk. Because of the circumstances of the pandemic, this year the pre-concert talk comes from my home to yours. Welcome and thank you for joining. The first piece on our program is by the Anglo-African composer Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Coleridge Taylor was born in a working class suburb near London, England. The record of his origins is somewhat murky, probably because his parents were interracial and not married. His father was in England only for medical studies and returned to his native Sierra Leone, perhaps before he even knew that Coleridge Taylor was on the way. So Coleridge Taylor was raised by his mother Alice, his grandparents, and eventually a stepfather in Croydon, the working class suburb of London. And Coleridge Taylor and his three step-siblings were all enrolled in music studies. Coleridge Taylor's grandfather gave him a violin and personally taught Coleridge Taylor from a young age. And the reports are that he was quite proficient on the violin early on. Coleridge Taylor also sang in the local church choirs, and so his earliest performances, both as a young singer and as a violinist, were in these churches. And there, one of the choir masters really appreciated his talent and arranged for Coleridge Taylor to have an audition and interview with Sir Charles Grove, the head of the Royal College of Music. And Coleridge Taylor was accepted there at the age of 15. At the Royal College of Music, Coleridge Taylor thrived. From violin, he moved on to study composition with Sir Charles Stanford, a leading composer of English church music, and there he garnered wide support. He had pieces played by the school orchestra frequently. He won the composition prize in both 1895 and 1896, and at that time the school orchestra was filled with not only the students but also the faculty, and so there would be, Gustav Holst maybe playing trombone and Von Williams playing triangle. Also, people from the community would come to hear the concerts, and in this way, Edward Elgar got to know the young Coleridge Taylor's music, as did Sir Arthur Sullivan of the Gilbert and Sullivan fame. And this is important because in 1898, this is a very important year for Coleridge Taylor, the Three Choirs Festival approached Edward Elgar to do a commission for their very famous festival. And Elgar said, I'm too busy, but why don't you ask this really gifted young man, Samuel Coleridge Taylor? And indeed, they commissioned him to write his ballade in A minor, and that was his professional debut as a composer. In the same year, the school orchestra and chorus premiered his cantata, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. This piece was wildly popular in his lifetime, getting hundreds of performances. And so 1898 was a really, really important year. Samuel Coleridge Taylor was deeply involved in the Pan-African movement, particularly the African-American portion of that movement. In 1896, he met the African-American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, and they collaborated on two recitals of works for voice and piano, including a song cycle, 7 African romances, and a work called Dream Lovers, which is described as an operatic romance by Paul Laurence Dunbar and Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Coleridge Taylor was also introduced to spirituals. He was introduced by the Fisk Jubilee Singers during their 1899 tour of London. Now, the Fisk Jubilee Singers were famous, and in fact they're still operating, and they started when the university was founded around the 1870s, and they regularly made tours of Europe and raised money for the university. And so you can find all sorts of pictures and programs from back then, and this connection between Coleridge Taylor and the Fisk Jubilee Singers was really important for two reasons. One, the spirituals became a major focus of Coleridge Taylor's work. Right away after hearing them, he wrote a piano piece called 24 Negro Melodies, Opus 59, for piano. In the program notes for this piece, he wrote, "What Brahms has done for the Hungarian folk music, Dvorak for the Bohemian, and Grieg for the Norwegian, I have tried to do for these Negro melodies. The plan adopted has been almost without exception that of theme and variations." Okay, so this music has had a big influence on Coleridge Taylor and what he composes, thereafter. Not all pieces, plenty of them sound perfectly English, but this becomes a focus of his life. Now, so the second reason that this meeting of the Fisk Jubilee Singers is important is because the appreciation was mutual. African Americans loved the music of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, and he was appreciated so much that a group in Washington, D.C. Founded a chorus called the Samuel Coleridge Taylor Choral Society. And they also arranged for Coleridge Taylor to come to the U.S. on 3 tours in 1904, 1906, and 1910. And on these tours, Samuel Coleridge Taylor traveled all over the country, conducting orchestras and getting premieres of his music. Notably, the virtuoso violinist Maud Powell premiered his violin concerto, and also the president, Theodore Roosevelt, invited him to the White House. So these tours were highly successful. Unfortunately, shortly after Coleridge Taylor's last tour, he died at the age of 37. Supposedly of pneumonia from overwork, and indeed he had these tours. He was composing and conducting. He led several choruses, several orchestras, and taught at a university. So perhaps that's true. But we lost him early on. But he left behind a huge amount of excellent music. So the 4 novelletten for strings, tambourine, and triangle, Opus 52, was written in 1903 and published by Novello. The publisher of Novello was a friend of Coleridge Taylor's from his Royal College days. So the pun, novelletten published by Novello, is probably intended. And it was written as salon music. And there's a version for just violin and piano, as well as the string orchestra plus 1 percussionist version. And so the novelette number 1 is the one we're going to play, and it has a real waltz feel. It's got this wonderful English string orchestra sound with lovely coloring from the triangle and tambourine, and it has its sweeping waltz gestures, and to me it sounds like musical champagne. It has these sort of cork-popping gestures. And it's a wonderful teaser, perhaps to spark your curiosity about his other wonderful music. He's really worth listening to. I note that Samuel Coleridge Taylor remarked upon Dvorak and his efforts to create a Czech national music in those program notes that he wrote for his 24 Negro Melodies. So let's explore that a bit. Dvorak was born in a village, very rural village that's about 14 miles northwest of Prague. His father was a butcher and innkeeper who also played the zither, and may have played in the tavern that was part of their inn, and Dvorak would have heard a lot of folk music in that setting. Okay, and the young Dvorak studied organ and violin from the church organist in the local church, and that's where he gave his earliest performances. When Dvorak was about 12, they moved to Zlany's, a larger town, and there Dvorak found a really great teacher who, in addition to the violin and organ lessons, added harmony lessons. And this got Dvorak started with composition. All right. And this teacher was also influential in convincing Dvorak's father to send the 16-year-old son to the Prague Organ School, which is also known as the Prague Church School. And there he was able to study composition as well as organ. And after graduating, he lived in Prague, doing what you do after school, eking out a living, playing viola gigs in a dance orchestra, and as principal violist of the Provincial Theater, which was conducted by Bedřich Smetana, by the way. And he began composing. Money was really tight for Dvorak, and and once he got married and had a growing family, this became more acute. So he also was teaching private lessons, took a church organ job, and his wife, who was a wonderful singer, also took church gigs. So that's how they existed. But Dvorak wanted more time for composing rather than playing all these gigs. And so he applied for an Austrian state stipendium for young artists. And fortunately for us, Johannes Brahms was on the jury and really appreciated Dvorak's music, and he won the stipendium, and he kept winning it for about 5 years. And with this, Dvorak was incredibly prolific. So we're very, very fortunate that happened. He gave up his day gigs, or his regular gigs. So like Beethoven, some have organized Dvorak's work into compositional periods. In his 20s, his earliest symphonies and chamber music were influenced by the classical Viennese composers, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. For about 2 years in his late 20s, early 30s, Dvorak had a Wagner era. And he wrote an opera and a couple string quartets for that time. And they're said to be highly avant-garde. I've only heard the third string quartet. It's an hour long. And it's interesting because it definitely has Wagnerian gestures. But my opinion is that Wagner's language and ethos just simply does not fit into the string quartet genre. I don't even think it fits in the symphonic genre, although Mahler and Bruckner might have something to say about that. But I suspect that Dvorak came to a similar conclusion because his next style period crossed over into the other camp. If you recall, there was the Wagner camp and the Johannes Brahms camp, and never the twain shall meet. So the next compositional style for Dvorak was the sort of Brahmsian camp, but with a new element, very much influenced by Bedřich Smetana. Smetana had started taking folk music from his native Moravia and incorporated those elements into his compositions in the effort to create a Czech national music. And Dvorak started doing the same, experimenting with using elements of folk music from his native Bohemia into his compositions. And so at this time you've got his influences are Johannes Brahms and these folk elements, and he finds his voice. I mean, this is the voice that we recognize, as Dvorak. I will circle back for one moment and say that this Wagnerian influence comes back later in Dvorak's life, when towards the very end, when he writes his operas Russalka and Amida. These are very, you can hear the Wagner influence in these operas, and I'm mentioning it because it supports my thesis that maybe Wagner can't be squeezed into a string quartet, but is a perfectly fine influence for writing operas. That's my thesis. I'm sticking by it. The Mahler-Bruckner part of this is for another discussion. Back to Dvorak and his voice that he finds in his 30s while he's composing on this Austrian state stipendium for young artists. The first year of this grant, he was incredibly prolific, and that's when he wrote the string serenade that we're performing tonight. Okay, so the serenade was written in just 2 weeks in May 1875, and it's in 5 movements that uses traditional formal structures while also incorporating folk elements in its melodies and dance rhythms. The first movement, Moderato, is in an A-B-A form, where the A section is a lovely simple melody that alternates between the violins and cellos, and the B section is a stately dance rhythm. I like to imagine a village wedding in the stately dance. The next movement is the Tempo de Valse. It's fascinating because it's also an ABA form, which is not a typical waltz form. It's more like a minuet form. Okay, but the A section is a waltz, and the B section is a trio, like minuet and trio. So that's why it seems like a hybrid form. So the waltz portion, though, introduces folk dance rhythms, particularly that of the furient. Okay, and so in art music, the quintessential furient is Dvorak's Slavonic dance, number 8. It's very familiar, perhaps. Here we go. It has this 2 against 3 tug to it, and in the Tempo de Valse of the string serenade, this 3 against 2 tug is more subtle, but it's still there and distinguished. And that sort of 3 against 2 is called a hemiola, which many of us know from Baroque music. It's a very typical gesture, but it also appears a lot in folk music. And I don't know if there's any historic connection of the hemiola between Baroque music and folk music, but it is a very distinctive characteristic of this music. Also interesting is that the waltz is in the key of C sharp minor. But the trio section, which is really, really quite sublime, it's in the parallel major, which would be C sharp major, only he spells it D flat major. Essentially, it uses most of the black keys on the piano, and those can be spelled as either sharps or flats, interestingly enough. But there's a phenomenon where the flat version have a different sound than the sharp version. I don't know why. It's the same keys on the piano, but that is the phenomenon that many people experience, and perhaps especially when it's string players, because we really can manipulate the pitch more than you can on piano. Okay, so another feature of this sublime trio section is that Dvorak uses really, really stunning harmonies that change the color and the feeling tone. And you can listen for this because he's got these beautiful phrases, he builds up these beautiful lines, and at the top of the line, he will do something harmonically that is just magical. So that's something I would recommend listening for, because it's very, very special. The third movement is a scherzo that resembles a playful round at the beginning. Right? The cello start, and the violins copy them, back and forth, and but in the middle it has soaring melodies, and it has a rather nostalgic ending. The fourth movement is a gorgeous, sort of slowish melody, and it has this mysterioso middle section. And for some reason, there's no evidence for this whatsoever. This is just what I think about this music. The melody resembles like a love letter to me, and that middle section music, to me, it sounds like forest music at dusk, complete with little surprises from forest elves or something. Like I said, there's no evidence for this. This is not a program piece, unlike the Vivaldi. It's just the imagery that I have when I do this piece. The final movement resembles a dance called a dumka, or a form called a dumka, that comes from folk music, and a dumka is essentially music that has really dramatic mood swings. So this particular movement starts like it's on fire, and then but it also has a tune that's filled with melancholy, and it shifts back from the fire music to the melancholy music, to the fire. It's and has a very dramatic finale. So that is the string serenade in a nutshell. And I think that what's important historically is that is right at that era when he has really found his voice, and you can really hear it in this piece. Sorry about that interruption from my cat. The Vivaldi Four Seasons is very well known, of course. It's one of the best known pieces in classical music, and we're doing autumn and winter. The program has a page where you can sort of follow the structure and what's going on, and it also has the sonnet that Vivaldi wrote and based the work on. So Vivaldi wrote a sonnet about summer and spring and summer and fall and winter, and in the music there are letters that correspond to the place in the sonnet that's being depicted. So it's really clear. I mean, this is program music, and there's no ambiguity about what's being depicted. We know exactly where the peasants are celebrating the harvest. We know when they're on a hunt and what happens to the poor deer. We know which portion is sitting by the fire on a cold, rainy day in winter, or slipping on the ice. It's all there, and soloists and orchestras have a variety of ways of depicting these scenes, including the gunshots, the chattering teeth in winter, and the war between the winds, the north wind and the south wind, that is the energizing driving force to the finale of the Concerto Winter. So I hope you enjoy our program tonight, and thank you for tuning in.